The question of how a dominant world power loses a war it appears structurally incapable of losing is not merely a rhetorical provocation, but a foundational problem in the study of imperial decline. History offers an unambiguous answer. Great empires do not fall because stronger adversaries defeat them on the battlefield. They collapse because they become locked into strategic patterns that no longer serve their interests. Patterns from which, due to institutional inertia, ideological rigidity, and the structural demands of maintaining hegemony, they cannot extricate themselves. Rome, the Mongol Empire, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union each exemplifies this dynamic. None was destroyed by a superior military force. Each was undone by its own compulsive repetition of failing strategies, its inability to adapt to a changing world, and the gradual exhaustion of the political will and material resources necessary to sustain overextension. The contemporary geopolitical landscape, which this essay analyses through a structural framework of competing national interests and grand strategies, presents a configuration strikingly consistent with this historical pattern. Understanding it requires a precise account of the four principal actors currently shaping the trajectory of global order: the United States, Russia, Iran, and Israel. To analyze these actors with appropriate rigor, it is useful to employ what may be termed a stratified chess framework, a conceptual architecture that disaggregates national power into its constituent components. The political system of any state constitutes its most fundamental vulnerability and its most enduring asset. It is the institutional core around which all strategic behavior is organized, and its collapse represents the definitive end of a state's capacity to act as a coherent geopolitical agent. Grand strategy, the overarching vision that guides how a state seeks to secure and expand its interests within the international system, functions as the animating logic behind all major policy decisions. The operational instruments of grand strategy, encompassing military capability, economic leverage, intelligence operations, and diplomatic influence, are the mechanisms through which grand strategy is pursued. Finally, client states and proxy actors serve as expendable instruments deployed in the service of larger strategic objectives, their welfare subordinated to the imperatives of the sponsoring power. With this framework in place, it becomes possible to analyze each of the four principal actors with the precision that the complexity of the current moment demands. The United States presents a paradox that is simultaneously its greatest source of dynamism and its most exploitable strategic vulnerability. American democracy, as a political system, has historically rewarded innovation, intellectual openness, and competitive meritocracy, producing the technological and economic institutions, from Silicon Valley to Wall Street, that underpin American global dominance. Yet democracy contains within it a structural susceptibility to polarization that, at sufficient intensity, becomes strategically debilitating. The American political system has reached a condition in which partisan conflict has assumed a zero-sum character, with the principal factions investing more institutional energy in the delegitimization of domestic opponents than in the coherent prosecution of long-term national strategy. This polarization is not merely a domestic inconvenience. It constitutes a strategic opening for adversaries who understand that the most effective path to diminishing American power is not military confrontation, but the deliberate deepening of internal fracture. American grand strategy, which scholars have characterized as a form of defensive hegemony, is organized around two related imperatives: the absolute security of the North American homeland and the maintenance of a global order in which no rival power or coalition of powers can challenge American primacy. The instruments through which this strategy is pursued are threefold: unrivaled military force, the structural dominance of the US dollar as the currency of international trade, and technological supremacy anchored in artificial intelligence and information infrastructure. The states that execute American strategic directives, the European Union, the Gulf Cooperation Council, Japan, South Korea, and others, function in practice as expendable assets whose interests are subordinated to the requirements of American grand strategy when the two conflict. Russia's position on the contemporary geopolitical board is defined by a political system of authoritarian traditionalism, remarkable for its social durability precisely because it is organized around values, Orthodox Christianity, conservative nationalism, and civilizational continuity that are deeply rooted in Russian historical consciousness. The Russian state's resilience cannot be adequately understood without reference to what historians have termed the Third Rome ideology. Following the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, the Russian state declared itself the inheritor of Christian civilization, the last institutional bulwark against the secular decadence of the West. This is not historical artifact. It is the living ideological framework within which Vladimir Putin and substantial segments of the Russian public understand the current conflict. The implication is strategically significant. Russia cannot be bought out of its present commitments because its commitments are not primarily material, but civilizational. Sanctions, however severe, cannot produce surrender from a population that has historically endured the Mongol invasion, the Napoleonic campaign, 2 world wars, and Stalinist terror. Russia's strategic instruments rest on 3 foundations: the largest natural gas reserves in the world, which translate into genuine coercive leverage over European energy markets, a military apparatus demonstrated in Ukraine to be capable of absorbing extraordinary attrition while maintaining operational coherence, and geographical vastness, which has historically rendered Russia unconquerable by any external force. Iran represents what is perhaps the most sophisticated strategic actor in the current conflict, particularly in relation to the asymmetric instruments at its disposal. The Islamic Republic, established in 1979 as an explicitly anti-imperialist political order, has been subjected to continuous external pressure, American sanctions, assassinations of scientific personnel, and support for Iran's adversaries for 4.5 decades. Rather than producing collapse, this sustained pressure has resulted in the construction of a political system specifically engineered for institutional resilience under conditions of external attack. The assassination of the supreme leader, which left Iran's formal command structure without its apex figure for a full week, produced neither governmental paralysis nor popular capitulation. The armed forces continued operations, the bureaucratic apparatus continued to function, and millions of Iranian citizens engaged in public demonstrations of national solidarity. This institutional design reflects a conscious strategic doctrine: the deliberate distribution of authority across multiple nodes so that no single assassination or decapitation strike can neutralize national resistance. Iran's grand strategy, which may be characterized as escalation dominance through attrition, is the direct inverse of the American preference for rapid, decisive victory. Iran does not attempt to defeat its adversaries quickly. It makes the cost of opposing Iran, economically, politically, militarily, so prohibitively high that adversaries eventually abandon the contest. The Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988 demonstrated this logic with historical precision. Despite being attacked by Iraq with the material support of the United States, Saudi Arabia, and European powers, Iran survived 8 years of industrial-scale warfare, while the Ba'athist regime that initiated the conflict eventually collapsed under the weight of the 2003 American invasion. Iran still stands. The operational instruments of Iranian strategy rest on 3 asymmetric advantages. Iran possesses a missile and drone inventory that numerically exceeds the combined interceptor capacity of the United States and Israel, creating an unsustainable economic arithmetic in which a single Iranian drone costing approximately $50,000 forces the launch of an American interceptor system costing between $3 and $10 million. Iran also controls the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of global oil supply passes, providing a structural mechanism for imposing severe costs on the global economy. Finally, Iran maintains the axis of resistance: Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi movement in Yemen, and affiliated militias in Iraq, which extends Iranian strategic reach across the region and multiplies the number of simultaneous pressure points it can activate. Israel's strategic position is the most complex and, for many analysts, the most counterintuitive of the four actors under consideration. Israel's political system is an ethno-nationalist democracy operating in the current period with a degree of internal cohesion. Surveys indicating that over 80% of Israeli Jews support the forcible displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, and over 65% regard the current conflict as existential, that neither the United States nor any of Israel's adversaries can match. Israel's grand strategy, openly articulated by Israeli political and religious figures across the ideological spectrum, is organized around the concept of territorial and hegemonic expansion across the broader Middle East. The geographic scope of this ambition, encompassing contemporary Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, the Arabian Peninsula, and parts of Egypt, corresponds precisely to the territories currently occupied by American military bases, financed by American security guarantees, and protected by American diplomatic cover. This overlap has a strategic implication of the first order that is almost universally neglected in mainstream analysis. The primary structural obstacle to Israeli expansionism is not Iran, but the United States, whose continued presence in the Middle East precludes Israeli dominance of the region. From this perspective, it is consistent with rational Israeli self-interest to maneuver the United States into a conflict in the Middle East that America cannot win, because an American strategic retreat from the region would eliminate the institutional infrastructure, the network of bases, alliances, and financial dependencies through which Washington currently constrains Israeli territorial ambition. Israel's operational instruments are correspondingly sophisticated. The intelligence apparatus responsible for the 2024 Lebanese pager operation and the extensive assassination network inside Iran represents the most capable covert action capability in the world. Israeli air power provides the ability to conduct long-range precision strikes, and Israel's influence within American political institutions through lobbying, the donor class, and media networks constitutes a lever of extraordinary and largely invisible power over American foreign policy itself. America, in this analysis, functions as an Israeli pawn, providing the military force, absorbing the financial costs, and bearing the diplomatic consequences of a conflict that serves Israeli grand strategy more directly than American strategic interests. The structural logic of the current conflict becomes most apparent when one examines the full range of strategic options available to the United States and traces each to its likely outcome. Should the United States escalate its bombing campaign against Iran, the effect would be the activation of additional underground missile infrastructure, an increase in the volume and effectiveness of Iranian retaliatory strikes, the accelerated depletion of American interceptor inventories at an economically ruinous exchange rate, the elevation of global oil prices, and the progressive erosion of American domestic political will. Should the United States commit ground forces to Iran, it would encounter a country that has spent 25 years constructing underground fortifications in mountain terrain specifically designed to defeat an American ground assault, while simultaneously triggering Iraqi militia movements into Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Houthi advances into Saudi Arabia from the south, a scenario in which American bases throughout the Gulf would be operationally surrounded and logistically exposed. Should the United States pursue negotiation, it would face Iranian terms: the closure of American military bases in the Gulf, the inclusion of Hezbollah, Palestinian factions, the Houthi movement, and Iraqi militias in any settlement, and the permanent end of sanctions that no American administration could accept without abandoning the structural foundations of its regional position. Should the United States seek to leverage Chinese and Russian pressure against Iran, it would find both powers actively benefiting from the conflict. China purchasing discounted Iranian oil in volumes that constitute de facto sanctions relief, and Russia relying on Iran as a central node in the north-south transport corridor linking Russia to the Indian Ocean. Should the United States pursue strategic patience and await Iranian domestic collapse under sustained bombardment, it would confront the empirical record. Serbia withstood 78 days of continuous NATO bombing without capitulating, and Iran is 4 times Serbia's geographic size with a demonstrated capacity for popular mobilization under conditions of external attack. Every strategic option available to the United States resolves through different mechanisms to the same terminal condition: an American strategic withdrawal from the Middle East. This structural convergence is not accidental. It is the characteristic pattern of declining empires. The historical record is unambiguous on this point. Athens, at the height of its power following the Persian Wars, launched the Sicilian expedition of 415 BCE, an amphibious invasion of Sicily that offered no proportionate strategic return and for which Athens possessed no adequate contingency planning. The expedition ended in the destruction of the Athenian naval force, the loss of tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors, and the permanent diminishment of Athenian power. Athens never recovered its pre-war strategic position and lost the Peloponnesian War within a decade. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 followed an identical structural logic. A declining superpower, experiencing growing economic dysfunction and ideological exhaustion, launched a military intervention with limited strategic rationale against a country that, through geography and social organization, was structurally resistant to occupation. 10 years of war, 15,000 Soviet combat deaths, and an economy bled of resources contributed materially to the Soviet collapse of 1991, just 2 years after the final withdrawal. The American prosecution of the current conflict in Iran reproduces this pattern with disturbing fidelity. A power already experiencing the fiscal and political symptoms of hegemonic overextension, committing resources to a conflict it cannot win against an adversary specifically designed to exploit its vulnerabilities. The deeper structural explanation for American strategic failure is to be found not in the competence or incompetence of individual decision makers, but in the institutional architecture of the American military-industrial complex itself. As the journalist and publisher Julian Assange observed, the strategic function of America's post-Cold War military engagements is not the achievement of decisive military victory, but the perpetuation of conflict in a form that maximizes the transfer of public resources to private defense contractors and the transnational financial networks associated with them. A military apparatus designed to generate profit rather than to achieve strategic objectives cannot win wars against adversaries for whom cost asymmetry, the ratio of damage inflicted to resources expended, is the primary instrument of strategy. A $50,000 Iranian drone that compels the expenditure of a $10 million American interceptor does not merely win a single exchange. It systematically degrades American strategic solvency at a rate no budget can indefinitely sustain. A resistance fighter operating on a monthly stipend that a major American defense contractor's chief executive officer would characterize as rounding error is inflicting costs on a military spending $900 billion annually. The arithmetic of empire, honestly computed, does not favor the United States. The post-American Middle Eastern order, toward which the current conflict is tending, will likely be organized around 2 intersecting trade and infrastructure networks. The first, which this analysis terms Pax Judea, would position Israel as the technological, financial, and data infrastructure hub of the regional economy, not through direct military occupation of neighboring territories, but through the control of AI infrastructure, data centers, financial architecture, and university networks that constitute the commanding heights of a 21st century regional hegemony. Israel already possesses more data center capacity than any other state in the Middle East, and its technological talent base and university infrastructure are unmatched in the region. The second network, organized around the Eurasian corridor, would position Iran as the central node of the Belt and Road Initiative and the North-South Transport Corridor, collecting infrastructure rents on the movement of goods, energy, and capital between Asia and Europe, and rebuilding its economy through Chinese and Russian investment freed from the constraints of American-led sanctions. The implications of these two networks coexisting are counterintuitive but consistent with the historical behavior of strong regional powers. Geopolitics operates according to the logic of interest, not ideology. If both Israel and Iran demonstrate that they are durable, capable, strategic actors, while the United States and the Gulf Cooperation Council demonstrate strategic vulnerability, the rational basis for Israeli-Iranian conflict diminishes and the rational basis for a negotiated division of regional influence increases. This is not prediction, it is game theory applied to the structural incentives of the post-hegemonic transition. The contemporary multipolar conflict should therefore be understood not as a conventional war between two great powers, but as the terminal phase of a hegemonic transition, a period in which the structural contradictions of American global dominance manifest simultaneously across multiple theaters. In Ukraine, the NATO alliance, under American direction, is engaged in a war of attrition against Russia that it is not winning. In the Middle East, the United States and Israel are prosecuting a campaign against Iran and the axis of resistance that cannot achieve its stated objectives. Across the Caribbean and Latin America, a decades-long economic blockade of Cuba has failed to produce the regime collapse for which it was designed. All three of these theaters are connected by a single strategic logic, articulated most clearly by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his 1997 work, The Grand Chessboard. Control of the Eurasian landmass constitutes the precondition for global dominance. An American strategy must prevent any single power or alliance from achieving such control. The United States is losing Eurasia on all three fronts simultaneously, not because its adversaries are militarily superior, but because the structural conditions that made American hegemony possible, dollar dominance, technological supremacy, the absence of credible great power rivals, are eroding at a rate that no military campaign can reverse. The conclusions of this analysis converge on three propositions that the historical and structural evidence supports with considerable confidence. First, the current conflict is a multipolar contest in which the decisive variable is not military superiority, but institutional coherence. The state that survives this period with the most intact political system, the most functioning economy, and the most coherent grand strategy will determine the character of the order that follows. By this measure, the United States is not the most likely candidate for lasting primacy. Second, the most strategically dangerous move is not the one that appears reckless, but the one that appears bold while concealing a structural trap. The American commitment to military confrontation with Iran, which presents itself as a demonstration of strength, is in practice a commitment from which the United States can neither withdraw without reputational damage, nor sustain without material exhaustion. Third, history does not reward the strongest actor. It rewards the most patient. Rome was not destroyed in a day. It was undone over centuries of incremental overextension, institutional corruption, and the progressive loss of strategic coherence. What the present moment exhibits is the same fundamental process, compressed by the velocity of a 21st century world into a timeline that may be measured in years rather than centuries. The board is configured, the strategic logic is clear, and every move available to the dominant power leads by different paths to the same destination.